Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The terrorist who carried out New Zealand's worst ever attack against the country's Muslim community has been charged with 50 counts of murder. It is unclear if he will be charged with terror-related offences. The court has also requested that the terrorist's mental health be evaluated to see if he is fit to stand trial. So far, the biggest consequence of the attack has been the Prime Minister's move to ban military-style weaponry. To discuss that a bit further, we're firstly joined by Dr. Dominic O'Sullivan, who is a political expert. He's also Associate Professor of Political Science at Charles Sturt University. He's joining us now from Canberra in Australia. Dominic, thanks for joining us here in Scope. Dominic, what do you make of this trial, these charges as they stand right now? Why do you think he is not being charged with terrorism?
The Suppression of Terrorism Act in New Zealand has a much more difficult threshold to meet in terms of a successful prosecution. The prosecution has to prove that the accused intended to cause terror, whereas for a murder charge to hold, all that's required is for the prosecution to prove that the accused intended to kill. So I think that's the reason. But in terms of the material outcome, in terms of the sentence that the accused can expect to face if indeed he's found guilty, it really doesn't make much difference. The mandatory sentence for murder in New Zealand is life imprisonment. Judges do have discretion to impose a non-parole period. They don't have to, so it is a situation where life could indeed mean life. And we'll obviously have to wait for the process to go through, for the trial to take place. It would be wrong to preempt that. But certainly in terms of possible sentences open to the court, there is no difference. And in terms of the likelihood of a conviction, it's just much simpler to charge the accused with murder. And there are, after all, 50 counts of murder and 39 of attempted murder.
But, Dominic, if I push you on that point, I understand I was reading up on the laws as well in New Zealand, especially the terrorism law, and what you've said is completely true. But then, it's also about the symbolism here, isn't it? Because the entire world really is watching with bated breath to see how, Tarrant will be held to account for his actions. And certainly it would be an important message to send, at the very least, to the world and to the national community as well within New Zealand about terrorism, wouldn't it?
I think that's certainly true. But what the Solicitor General will have to consider, her consent is required for the charges to be laid, is the possibilities of a conviction. And that depends as much on the wording of the law. It could be that Parliament hasn't written the law appropriately to capture this situation. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying it's something that the Solicitor General will have to take into account. But yes, symbolically, I think it is important. Certainly the Prime Minister and other members of the government have not shied away from using the word terrorism to describe this person's actions. The Prime Minister has also made a point of refusing to use his name, because that gives him the notoriety that he seeks, and I'm making that choice too, to not use his name. So there are other ways of dealing with the symbolism that's required here. But 50 charges of murder and 39 of attempted murder are unprecedented in New Zealand. There's an extraordinary symbolism in those charges too.
Okay, so then let's talk about this other aspect of this trial, and that is, of course, the judge saying that the mental health of the accused needs to be evaluated at this time to see if he is even fit to stand trial. That concerns me, because when I read it this morning, as I was looking at doing this show, Dominic, because one then wonders, will he get off scot-free in some way if his mental health is found to be in any way waning? Because, if we look at the history of how terrorist trials have happened and how these sorts of situations have been approached when it's been on the other side, if it's been a Muslim, for example, who has carried out any such a criminal act, Do you think that the courts are that forgiving ever towards a Muslim?
Well, I'm not aware that there has been a case in New Zealand, anything like this, where a Muslim person has perpetrated an equivalent.
Well, no, I mean, I'm obviously talking more generally, Dominic, about around the world, because obviously, as you can appreciate, this is something which all of us around the world are, watching with close scrutiny.
Of course. Now, I think as the judge explained in the court in Christchurch this morning, seeking a report on an accused's mental fitness to stand trial is standard practice in murder trials. So there's nothing unusual about that in itself. If the medical reports, I understand 2 reports have been ordered by the court, if those reports show that the accused is indeed unfit to stand trial, and there's no guarantee that that will be the case, but if that were the case, he certainly wouldn't get off scot-free. There are provisions for people to be detained indefinitely under mental health legislation. So I guess that the symbolism of a conviction would not be present, obviously, and some people would be concerned about that. But in terms of public safety and ensuring that this person couldn't go into society and commit that kind of atrocity again, that certainly wouldn't occur. There are protections against that.
Okay, so, in the first court appearance, which the terrorist had on March 16th, he had flashed an upside-down OK signal, which many people say is a symbol used by white power groups across the globe. And then, we obviously had this 70-odd page manifesto, which had been released, I believe, in advance of him carrying out these attacks. What do you make of that aspect of all of this, the white nationalism / white supremacy, whatever we want to term it, far right? What do you make of that aspect of this entire situation? Do you think that'll be something that needs to be addressed in some way, even by the judiciary?
Well, there was some suggestion that the accused was going to exercise his right to act for himself in court. And there were concerns raised that his reasoning for wanting to do that were to use the trial as a political platform to air those white supremacist views. Now, obviously, the trial judge would have powers available to him to ensure that didn't happen. But one of the developments that occurred today was that it was revealed that the accused has, in fact, instructed lawyers to act for him. So that obviously removes that very, very distasteful possibility from the trial. But I think there's no question when one looks at that hand symbol that was made in the first court appearance, and when one considers the manifesto, that white supremacist ideologies were certainly his motivation here. I don't think there's any secret about that. It's most distasteful. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has been at pains to suggest that that's not a value that's acceptable in New Zealand. It doesn't reflect prevailing views. And while she's made that very strongly, it has also brought to bear some views from Māori people in New Zealand, the indigenous population, saying, well, in fact, white supremacy isn't new. It hasn't been demonstrated in this way before, but there have been massacres against Māori in the 19th century as part of the British colonial project, and people certainly remember that. And many Māori people and others will tell you of their own experiences of racism on a day-to-day basis. So while certainly nothing as grotesque as this in New Zealand recent history, certainly white supremacy is not something that's utterly foreign to New Zealand.
Okay, so Dominic, I'm wondering that at this time, when we're talking about, and you're sitting obviously in Australia, so I think it seems appropriate to ask you this question. Do you think Australia as well is reflecting as a nation on the fact that this gentleman is an Australian, A, and B, where and why he would have gotten the ideas and the ideology and the extreme ideology, if I may term it that, in his mind to be able to carry out this attack? Obviously, he must have had help on the ground in New Zealand as well, no doubt. But then are the Australians also in some ways investigating this and acting upon this?
Well, I understand Australian authorities are cooperating with the New Zealand police in their investigation in terms of trying to answer some of those questions. But the initial reaction in Australia was one of utter revulsion and shock, of course, across the board. The Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, reacted immediately. He was one of the first world leaders to do so. However, very quickly people raised the question that white supremacy is certainly not the prevalent or dominant view in Australia, but it's not uncommon either. And, people raised the question that, well, Australia is a reasonable breeding ground for these sorts of ideas for people who are attracted to them. And very quickly after the attacks in Christchurch, a member of the Australian Senate made the suggestion that this atrocity occurred because New Zealand allowed Muslim immigration into New Zealand.
Yes.
And that was widely condemned. The Australian Senate unanimously passed a motion of censure just a couple of days ago against that senator. But you referred a moment ago to the white supremacist hand signal that the accused was seen to have made in court recently. That same symbol was used by several people attending a Liberal National Party fundraising event in the presence of two members of the Australian government. The Liberal National Party is the party of government in Australia. And in this image of these party members using that signal was circulated on social media by one of the members of the government concerned. And
yes.
That I think is telling.
If I may come in, Dominic, just because I wanted to ask you one final question before you go. I know you have a busy schedule, but I wanted to ask you then about the Islamophobia aspect of all of this. Do you think that it's important for even, again, I'll stick with Australia, because even Scott Morrison, Muslims have pointed out, has a troubling past vis-a-vis comments towards Muslims and migrants and immigrants in general as well. And then obviously Fraser Anning, as you had brought up, the senator from Queensland who did make that statement about Muslim migration being responsible for all of this. Do you think that it's important for these societies to now not just allow all of this sort of speech to be covered by, the guise of free speech and freedom of speech? So there needs to be some tackling of this sort of hateful talk?
Well, I think there does, and I think New Zealand is doing it a lot better than Australia. But if we just focus on Australia for a moment, there is quite significant Islamophobia in the country, and that's encouraged, I think, by migration. Australia is a country that's always depended on migrants for its labour force, its economic well-being, its economic growth is utterly dependent on migration. 49% of Australians were either born overseas or have a parent born overseas. So it's an entrenched part of the Australian way of life, of the Australian economy. And some people object to that, and some people object to Islam, the migration of Islamic people, because of that Islamophobia, but because of perceptions of overpopulation, overcrowding, and such like. It was also, I think, reinforced by the numbers of people seeking refugee status from the Middle East in particular. and coming by boat through Indonesia, and some objections to that among the community. So that's an example of the society being a breeding ground for this kind of white supremacy. And certainly both the government and the opposition Labour Party have seen votes and taking a hard line against migration from Islamic countries. And, that's something that the Christchurch attacks bring to great prominence.
Very well, Dominic. We'll leave there at that. But of course, we appreciate your time, your insight and analysis. That was Dr. Dominic O'Sullivan. He's an associate professor of political science at Charles Sturt University. He was speaking to us from Canberra in Australia. Now, viewers, as Dominic there was mentioning, there are a number of aspects to this, but of course that, firstly, of Australia itself. This terrorist is an Australian. So obviously the breeding ground for his ideology would have been within Australia itself. No doubt he had support on the ground in New Zealand, but it's troubling, of course, the politicians and the other white supremacist anti-Islam groups within Australia that continue to foster and grow. And then obviously New Zealand at this point in time bringing forth just murder charges, which in and of itself is not wrong. But then one wonders about the symbolic value of the need to show the rest of the world and even the local communities, the Muslim community especially, that even if the Prime Minister said that this is a terrorist attack, that this then follows up judicially. That this terrorist be held to account on those very terms as well. We'll keep a close eye on how that trial develops and what the mental health report comes out as well here in Scope. But thanks for watching. I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Welcome back, viewers, here in Scope. Now, the International Committee of the Red Cross has expressed concern about the fate of unaccompanied children currently residing in a camp in northeast Syria. The children were part of people that left the last areas controlled by ISIS. The ICRC has said that the children should be reunited with family members. It has requested that the countries of which they are citizens take them back. New security and humanitarian concerns have arisen from such a complex situation. To discuss that a bit further, we're now joined by our esteemed panelist, Dr. Lyal Sunga, who is a professor of former human rights officer as well, at the United Nations in Geneva. And he's an internationally recognized scholar and practitioner in international law, human rights, etc. He's joining us now from Rome in Italy. We're also joined by Christiane Waked, who is a columnist for several English and Spanish newspapers and websites. She is joining us now from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. And we're also joined by Dr. Hamid Al-Shejni, who is an academic expert in Arabic and international affairs. He's joining us now from Oxford in the UK. Lyal, Christiane, and Hamid, thank you all for joining us here in Scope and for taking our time out. Lyal, I'll start with you, if I may. What do you make of this situation now that ISIS has quote unquote been defeated? What does one then make of their family members, their children, their wives? It's quite a complex situation, isn't it?
It's complex enough simply because there's not a lot of political will or willingness on the part of countries that from where these, in effect, foreign fighters, ISIS foreign fighters, have come to Syria and Iraq. And often, I mean, the fighters themselves have participated in terrible acts, an outrage to human rights and international humanitarian law and the crimes under international law. So the feeling in many of public opinion across many countries is that we don't want to have anything to do with these people or any of their associates. Now, that kind of position goes obviously too far, because some people have gone and gotten married, and there's children. Children are innocent. Although a child is defined as anyone under 18, and there are some who may have joined and participated in war crimes, in which case they should be prosecuted. Yeah. The simple answer really is that people's nationality has to be respected, and that means they have a right to return to their country. And people should not have their nationality stripped away from them. That's a violation of international human rights law, and nobody should be rendered stateless. And as an opening statement, I would just point that out. So It's a question of human rights and humanitarian law.
Indeed. Christiane, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. You're in Lebanon itself, Christiane, and it seems appropriate to ask you this because Lebanon has taken in a lot of refugees as well. It's been one of those countries that has this time around as well. I wonder what you make of the mood there when it comes to this entire issue. I imagine there are concerns, security concerns, A, but then B, there is the whole humanitarian factor that the family members are not necessarily all to be blamed, are they?
Of course, we need to consider the offsprings of ISIS. We need to consider this as a humanitarian issue. These kids are stigmatized for their parents' choices in life, and I think no one should pay for their parents' mistake. And we must not forget that these kids are victims before anything, and that just witnessed a horrible war. Many of them are physically injured, and of course, most of them suffer from emotional trauma and have PTSD. Lebanon, among other countries, hosting countries, are worried that many of these ISIS members will come to Lebanon and Jordan since the governments are not accepting them. The simple answer is that governments should take responsibility of their citizens, and they should study this case by case. There must be clear extradition agreements, and they must be taken in consideration that there are physically wounded children that need special care during transportation, as well as a psychological follow-up. And in any case, these kids should return to normality, and the government should help them recover. And there must be consideration that many of the kids who were taken at a young age in Syria are now teenagers who have participated actively as child soldiers in war. These cases should be taken seriously, as well as their mothers, because they still endorse the extremist ideology. So governments must re-educate the kids trained by jihadists and teach them to integrate their country's values based on democracy, peace, equality, in order to reintegrate them back in society.
Hamid, I wanted to get, if you're saying, I wanted to go to Hamid. Hamid, you're in the UK, and, we know, Hamid, of that case of the ISIS bride, Shamima Begum, and, the fact that I believe her citizenship has been revoked as well. Her child then died, a UK citizen, no less. What do you make of not just that case, but just the precedent that has set, that citizenship is something that can be taken away if a criminal act is carried out, and no one is questioning that Shamima may have carried out a criminal act or at the very least made bad decisions. But beyond that, as Lyal there had mentioned in his answer, is citizenship, is nationality something that should be so easily taken away?
That's a very, very stupid thing to adopt. Actually, it has been adopted since September 11, and it was brought up by the Labour, and it was at the time meant to say if a crime committed in UK, then whoever have a dual nationality should stripped out of UK nationality, and that's not correct. You have to have a loyalty to the country that you belong on, and if you are threatened by your nationality, then you are losing that loyalty. At the same time, one of the very strange things that you find, they all have a blind eyes when all those say the criminals or jihadis or whatever it is went from this country to or any other country to Syria or Iraq, and they all let them go very peacefully. They might have coached them to go to their destiny, and now that their mission has been accomplished, they are abandoning them. And the phenomena of ISIS, to start with, it doesn't exist in the region. Prior to the fall of Saddam Hussein, there is no single incident that happened in Iraq. Prior to the problem that's happening in Syria, there isn't any single incident that we witnessed. So all this in here has been done for two purposes. One of the things is to justify the occupation of Iraq by the United States and to attack Syria and take some part of Syria for that reason, as well as to have a kind of virtual enemy for some of the regime in the Middle East, in that they could blackmail them and have them to pay a lot of money. If you remember when they start fighting, when they say they're going to fight ISIS in Iraq, they were demanding $500 million at the 500 billion at the time, which is half a trillion at the time. And you could ask, what's all this money gonna do? How many ISIS fighters? And when they went in Iraq, for example, in Fallujah, in the first attack against Fallujah without ISIS, all the international community were crying, saying that's a violation of human rights and so on. So they have to create an ISIS in that you could justify they're fighting against those that they are demanding their.
And that's a very good point that you brought up there, Hamid. If you allow me to bring that in, I want to get thoughts on that because Lyal, it does seem. From sitting from the outside looking in, it does seem a bit hypocritical, doesn't it? That it was, and I'm gonna pick on the U.S. for a moment here, Lyal. That it was the U.S. that went into Iraq, under the guise, of course, as we well know, of WMDs, all that, and that's a separate argument altogether. But the fact that it seems like these countries now want to wash their hands clean of this entire mess that they have at the very least, partly created.
There is that element, but I wanted to return something interesting that you had mentioned when you posed your first question to me, and that was you said that Shamima Begum had quite likely committed crimes and at least made bad decisions. That was in itself very interesting, and I'll tell you why. Okay. It's because a person is presumed. Has a right to be presumed innocent till proven guilty. That gets us back to the legal solutions, which are spelt out in international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. So it's not like the international community has not looked at this issue. There are a number of standards that have been developed and legal rules over time, which are designed to deal with this type of situation. So if I may, I would maybe mention a few of those because I think they could shed light on what is the objective, what are the objective rules out there for the situation. If a person commits a crime, a war crime, that they should be prosecuted for it. I think that's quite obvious. The difficult, some more complications arise where we're talking about juveniles that might be implicated in war crimes. And the issue is that war crimes have to be prosecuted, but it has to be done through a fair process.
Let me just stick with you, Lyal, for a moment, because in fact that question of accountability and justice is an important one, isn't it? There is talk, Lyal, of trials now for ISIS members or those who are at the very least accused of being members of ISIS. The countries, many of the countries around the world of which these ISIS members are citizens of will say those trials should take place in Iraq and Syria because that was the venue point of where these criminal acts were carried out. What are your thoughts on that? Should they be going back to their home countries and be tried there, or should they be tried by Iraq and Syria?
There are several grounds for jurisdiction, and that means that several countries could prosecute. Let me just put them in a very succinct fashion. Normally, a country prosecutes a crime when it's committed in the territory, in its territory, and that's territorial jurisdiction. So Syria and Iraq certainly have jurisdiction to prosecute those crimes.
Okay.
The second one is nationality. So if your national commits a crime outside your state, outside the territory of your state, that country also has jurisdiction. So the question is, however, are the Syrian and Iraqi trials going to be fair and independent? Would they be so biased? So that raises a question, because we're talking not just about a trial, but we're talking about fair trial standards that are important in international human rights law and international humanitarian law, international criminal law. And so one has to be very vigilant. Of course, it's easy for us to say, well, they should be prosecuted in Syria and Iraq. There's a lot of advantages for that in terms of getting evidence, in terms of getting witnesses, in terms of prosecuting the case. It can be much more complicated.
Okay, hold on to those thoughts, Lyal. I do appreciate one of you just brought on. We will go into a short break now, viewers. Lyal, Christiane, and Hamid, stay with us. We're going to continue the conversation after that break. Our viewers, thanks for staying with us here in Scope as we continue to discuss this issue of ISIS family members, essentially. At this point, we're still joined by our esteemed guests, Lyal, Christiane, and Hamid. Christiane, I wanted to start off this segment with you, and I wanted to ask you as well, Christiane, then about accountability. What are your thoughts on that? How should that occur? How should trials take place? What will justice look like?
I want to add something to what Lyal said.
Sure.
There are many the kids who lost both of their parents in Baku, and many of them lack papers of identification. And some kids might also use fake identities. So there are many cases that should be, as I said before, studied case by case. And this must be considered by local government in collaboration with NGOs and international community. As per the justice, the Syrian Democratic Forces have called for an international trial for these the ISIS members. But as I said, the kids should be, like the infants should be repatriated instantly because an infant from 0 to 3 years is innocent and has done nothing. As for the other kids, these must be taken by their own governments, and every case should be studied individually, and they have the right to a fair trial, followed by a right basis assessment of their needs. So there should be the trials should be in full compliance with international laws.
And then what do you think of ISIS members themselves, like the adults, Christiane, for example, those who are accused of being ISIS members? Should those trials take place within Syria and Iraq itself?
All of them, they should be trialed in their own countries. I don't know how accurate the justice system will be in Syria or in Iraq, as they have so many issues right now. I think if there can be fair trials in their own countries, I think they should face this kind of trials.
Okay, that's a good point. Hamid, what are your thoughts on? Because, I would imagine that if we're looking around the world in many countries again, be it the US, be it the UK as well, and I believe it was Germany and Italy as well, who have obviously been hesitant about taking back anybody who is at the very least accused of being part of ISIS and or related to ISIS fighters or terrorists, I should say. Do you think that is a valid security concern, A, and B, what do you make of the trials and where they should take place?
I think there is a double standard in here that we find in some of those countries. I.e., if you find an original that has been one of ISIS member or Al-Qaeda previously, whatever it is, they score them back all the way to the United States or to Europe or wherever, and they say that they have to be in the country's court of law. And the example of that is Steve Walker, if you remember, that was picked up in Afghanistan, and all of them went to Guantanamo, while this guy was taken out and was trial in the United States. And despite the fact there were many British citizens with Asian background, nobody talked about them, and they were later released. As a matter of fact, they were interrogated in the Middle East and in some of the MI5 intelligence services. So we are here. We have to be very realistic. We have to have a definition of criminals. We have to have a definition of terrorists. We have to have one standard for everybody, either to be like a British to be tried in UK, for any country in the world, or you are not like second-class citizen, or you are not having the same value, and then you let to be tried anywhere in the world. And that's the problem that we have at the time being. And the thing in here, as I say, ISIS to start with, we have to discuss the issue. How did ISIS started? At the same time, how did Al-Qaeda started? It's the same myth. It's the same phenomena. Who recruited them from all over the world? Isn't it the United States was in control of Iraq after invasion? It is the occupying force that's supposed to be in charge. So they were in charge, and they were having a blind eyes to recruit many and coming from all over the world. Some of them, they have been securely fled out of Syria and Iraq peacefully to countries that nobody knows where, okay? While others, those that they have like no hijab or veil or whatever it is, and children, they are abandoned. And the issue in here, how is the child going to be a threat to a country? I couldn't understand that. Because by the end of the day, when you bring it to a country and raise them with a democratic principle and love of human being and love of humanity and humanitarian and stuff like that, they're gonna be completely 180% different. Rather than abandon them in that area, you are raising criminals, because by the end of the day, if you abandon them, surely they're gonna start adapting the same method that their parents were doing if they were criminals by the end of the day.
And that's a very good point you made there, Hamid, because, Lyal, I wanted to, cite two examples, in fact, because it's not like all countries around the world are rejecting their citizens who are either ISIS family members or otherwise. Tajikistan, for example, has said that it is going to take back all children who are its citizens, who may be related to those who are accused of being part of ISIS. Russia also has some sort of a repatriation policy in place, the details of which I don't have exact details of, but it's been praised, in fact, Russia, that is, for putting in place some sort of an organized strategy about trying to repatriate these people back, A, and B, then trying to bring them back into society and rehabilitate them in some way. So it is possible to do that then, isn't it, Lyal? And it just seems like, again, going back to Hamid's point, that it seems like there is some sort of a double standard at play here?
We can talk about double standards, I think, indefinitely. But I would rather stay away from polemics, because then we get into pure political and ideological debate. This is a serious humanitarian issue involving children that are in need of care. But we have to also distinguish, and just to be realistic about this. And that is that, and Peter Morer from the International Committee of the Red Cross has rightfully signaled that there are around 3,000 children in urgent need of humanitarian care. That's not a large number, actually. If you look at the number of women and minors who have been fighting in or have been in ISIS territory and associated with ISIS fighters, it's around 41,000. About 4,600 of those are women, and about 4,500 minors being under the age of 18. Now, one has to distinguish carefully, because if we're talking infants, etc., or anyone under the age of 12 or under the age of 18 who has humanitarian needs, they have to be taken care of. In fact, it's true for adults as well. But that doesn't mean it's not a black and white situation, because there are some cases. Otherwise, we'd be naive not to say this. There are some cases where a person short of 18 years, a day short of 18 years old, or 17 or 16, who's been involved in war crimes, it doesn't mean that just because they're under the age of 18, they have no criminal responsibility. And countries recognize this. The Geneva Convention's Additional Protocol 1 recognizes that 15 and over, a person could be responsible for committing war crimes. And that's the standard also in international human rights law, in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and an optional protocol on children in armed conflict. So one has to distinguish, and Christiane was very much correct to say that there has to be case-by-case triage, and if there is evidence that a person has been perpetrating war crimes, and they're of a certain age and maturity, then it's possible they should definitely be prosecuted. Countries have states have an obligation, a legal obligation, to prosecute war criminals.
They have an obligation, Lyal, but and I want to come in because that's a good point to bring up. Obviously, many of these countries around the world, of which these people are citizens, do have an obligation towards their citizens, and the international community in general does too. But Christiane, I wonder then, the political will, and I think it was Lyal who had brought that up in his first answer, the political will doesn't really exist in most parts of the world to even deal with the situation. It just seems like everybody wants the situation to just go away. So in that sort of case, Christiane, then it seems like countries like Lebanon, like Syria, Iraq will just have to deal with these things on their own. That's a bit of a scary outlook, is it not?
It is indeed a scary outlook, because Lebanon, we have like almost 2 million refugees for a population of 4 million refugees. Now, the situation is now critical economically and socially, and everything is critical in Lebanon. And no one wants to take off the burden of these hosting countries. Everyone, like European organizations and everyone, like they are like throwing money in these countries just to keep the refugees there, because they don't want anything to do with these refugees. Let's be clear out from this. Another thing I want to add, like the past 2 months, around 50 kids from ISIS offspring lost their lives from hypothermia and medical conditions in the northeastern camps in Syria, and nobody's talking about this. You know, these past months, the region, Lebanon and Syria, we had a long, harsh winter where night temperature really regularly dipped below freezing. And so, I don't know, it's like really an urgent humanitarian crisis, and no one wants to deal with it. Like everybody wants to push this away and keep like it's not their own problem. We have to remind these governments that this is your problem. You created these issues. Who facilitated the coming of these jihadists to Syria? I mean, they have to face their own responsibility. Enough with denial.
Indeed, and that's a point that Hamid, that you had brought here as well. What is the feeling you get, Hamid? And I know that the UK obviously is distracted by the entire Brexit situation, but apart from that, do you think UK officials and society understands that, you know, that it will need to at some level also deal with their own citizens and possibly even their own role in this entire crisis?
You are right in here. In UK, most of them are preoccupied with Brexit. And as it is the case with Brexit, society is divided, the government is divided. It is also with this case, the government and the society are divided. They are not all agreeing to one measure or another. There are many lobbying for those children in UK. There are many humanitarian rights group that they have demanding the return of those that they are British citizens. Some of the in the government as well as in the opposition party has been also criticizing the decision not to take an action pretty quick. But unfortunately, being preoccupied with Brexit and also trying to shift the blame somewhere else, it's the easiest way to get rid of many of the problem, i.e. to say those are not we have nothing to do with them, they don't take authority from us, they have done so and so and so on. And the problem is that the United Nations unfortunately become a club of the richest, i.e. for the club of those that they are the decision maker in the world. So they can't make a kind of firm decision and go by it. Regardless, of the, we will start discussing the double standard, and you say, as you say, the point has been shifted away, and it is the cause of all this problem. Who is to hold the United States responsible in Iraq? Who is to do that? The United Nations can't do that because simply it's influenced by the United States to start with. So until we get to a territory that there is an independent body that can say, right, this is right and that's wrong, then nothing is going to be solved.
Okay, we'll leave there as our final word. The clock is gust of us, but we do sincerely appreciate all of your times, your insight and analysis, and putting that in conversation into context for us. That was Dr. Hamid Al-Shejni, who is speaking to us from Oxford there in the UK. He's an academic expert in Arabic and international affairs. We were also joined by Ms. Christiane Waked, who is a columnist for several English and Spanish newspapers and websites. She was speaking to us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. And we were also joined by Dr. Lyal Sunga, who is professor and also former human rights officer for the UN in Geneva. He was speaking to us from Rome in Italy. Now, viewers, as we've spoken about when we've covered quite a bit of ground here, but it's an important and complex situation, of course, no doubt, about those who may possibly be family members of those who have been members of ISIS. How does one deal with their children, those who are minors? How does one deal with their spouses? How does one deal with them as well? Trials, repatriations, citizenship. What does all of that mean in the grand scale of things at this point? Are there double standards at play? Then obviously, who created this entire mess in the region? Who came in? Who intervened? Who assaulted and occupied countries? All of that is an important part of this conversation as well. And the international community cannot just clean its hands of the situation and pretend like it's not happening and just throw money at countries, as Christiane said, like Lebanon or others who are currently hosting many, many refugees. We'll keep a close eye on how this situation develops going further. No doubt this is not the last of this that we hear, but I'll leave it there for now. This has been Scope, and I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.